We did not manage to pull off the feeding of the 50 with the 5. Obviously lacks the appropriate faith to make that happen, so apologize for that. Now, taking the most liberal estimate, when you look at having literally millions of pages of text, when you look at how large those pages are, we have about 400,000 variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. However, 99% of these variations cannot be translated out of Greek. That is, they do not impact the meaning of the text. So, in other words, using the strictest definition of a variant, as long as there is any difference in that long line of capital letters. Remember last night? I mentioned, if you weren't here last evening, I mentioned that up until the 9th century, New Testament manuscripts were written in all capitals, no spaces between words, almost no punctuation. So imagine what that would look like even in English. It would be very difficult for you to read that in English. It's very difficult for most people, even seminary-trained pastors who were trained in Greek, to read New Testament Greek in the manuscripts because it's all in capitals and it's a long line of letters. But 99% of those cannot be translated out of Greek. In other words, if you attempted to explain what the difference was in another language, the variation really would not impact the translation into another language. There's something called the movable nu. In the English language, you're supposed to say an apple, though that's seemingly falling out of practice these days, but you're supposed to put an N before another vowel. The same thing happens in the Greek language as well. Copyists had a real problem with that. And so you can't, it doesn't change the meaning, but it's still considered a variant. Of the remaining variants, the vast majority are simple errors of sight or hearing, depending on how the manuscript was produced. Now, I think there is something to explain at this point that I mentioned very briefly last evening, but I'll mention it again. There's two ways to produce manuscripts. There is the standardized way of having a manuscript or more than one manuscript in front of you, and you make a hand copy of the manuscript that is in front of you. So one scribe making one copy at a time. And obviously that happened a lot. That's where errors of homoiteliuton, remember last evening, similar endings, ditography, repeating something twice, these types of things would happen in that type of a context. But there was also a scriptorium. And the scriptorium was the professional way of producing, of really it'd be like a publishing house. It was the ancient equivalent of a publishing house. There were certain authors that were extremely popular even in their own lifetimes. And so if you wanted to have a lot of copies made, then you might have a room with 10 scribes in it. And you would have a reader who is reading the original, and the scribes are in essence taking dictation. That removes errors of sight on the part of the scribes, but not on the part of the reader. So you now have two opportunities of error. If the reader misreads, that misreading now produces 10 errors rather than just one. So there had to be great care taken. But now you introduce errors of hearing. And errors of hearing are actually more difficult than errors of sight, because you can double check something. You can look back at something and check your work. But when you're hearing something, it's fascinating how our minds work. And if your mind starts to vary, it starts to wander at all, and there's already some of you in here that your minds have started to wander. And I've only been speaking for about 90 seconds. And that's my fault primarily. But if your mind starts to wander, if you've got something you've got to get done this afternoon, if you've got something coming up on Monday, you've got a major test, you got a paper due, whatever the situation might be, it's very easy for your mind to wander. Now, if you were taking notes or copying down what I was saying, once that mind starts to wander, that is going to greatly degrade the accuracy of what you're taking down. And there's the other issue, and that is that languages were not designed by computers. They developed over time. And they were always spoken before they were written. And so what that means is that, think of how many words we have in English, that we love puns because we can, our language just has so many words that have more than one meaning. Or you think of the word light and the different ways you can spell it and different things you can do with it. And it all developed over time. And now with the internet, whole new words have developed, half of which don't make much sense, but you see how that's happening over time, and it's happening even faster now than it used to in the past. And so we know, for example, that when I read Greek, I'm using an artificial pronunciation system. It's called the Erasmian pronunciation system. And we know it's not how ancient Greek was actually pronounced, but it actually makes more sense than how ancient Greek was actually pronounced, because it differentiates between all the vowel sounds. So you can actually tell very clearly what word I'm intending to communicate. Ancient Greek didn't necessarily work that way. And one of the reasons we can tell this, if you look at 1 John chapter 1, you'll notice, you'll have footnotes. These things I've written to you that our joy or your joy might be made full. Hard to tell, it's text variant. And and so often the pronouns for yours and ours are confused, that it's pretty obvious that they are pronounced almost identically. And if you were not listening carefully and did not, raise your hand and say, which one was that? Could you, is that ours or yours? It would be very easy in a scriptorium to produce textual variants at that point because of the similarity of pronunciations. There were a number of words like that. And especially when the word was being spoken, you could have that type of variation take place. And so in the production of those manuscripts, you had those two different mechanisms in use. We've already talked about homoteleuton at 1 John 3:1, similar endings. These kinds of scribal errors are common and widely expected in any widely transmitted document. As long as one has a robust manuscript tradition representing various geographical areas and containing early witnesses, these kinds of variations are rather easily detected. Now, why would I say representing various geographical areas? Well, if you only have manuscripts from one particular area, travel, though it did take place, and though there were manuscripts that were distributed, that might have been written in Italy that we end up having in Egypt. That did happen, especially during the Pax Romana, during the Peace of Rome. We see how far Paul traveled and things like that. So there was travel, but not anywhere on the level that we have today. I mean, it's just amazing when I think of where I've traveled this year and the speed with which you're able to do those things. I've traveled farther this year than the majority of ancient men traveled in their entire life, for obvious reasons. You can go so much faster now than you could at that point in time. And so there's much more, and you throw the internet in, and the idea of local text is no longer relevant, but it was back then. And you would get a text type around Byzantium, for example, that is very homogeneous, that becomes very popular in one particular area. And so if you have manuscripts from multiple areas, then you're getting a wider representation. And that's what we're talking about here. That's a robust manuscript tradition. But all of these considerations, everything I've been talking about so far, relate primarily to a freely transmitted text, not to a controlled, edited, or redacted text. That's the key issue. And this is, if you get this, You're way ahead of most, and again, how many people were not here last evening? Okay. I keep repeating stuff, but I'm doing it for your benefit, for those of you who were here before. You get this, and you are light years ahead of the vast majority of ministers in our country, unfortunately, because this is just not, it's not the kind of stuff that is being emphasized in seminaries the way that it needs to be. And many, well, when my dad went to Moody Bible Institute, there was a professor there by the name of Kenneth Wiest. Some of you have seen Wiest's word studies. And he was pretty well known for being a really tough Greek professor, really difficult. And there were two tracks that you could take at Moody at that time. There was the pastoral track and the missions track. To get the pastoral degree, you had to take Greek. To do missions, you didn't. And so it was said that Kenneth Wiest sent more men to the mission field than anyone else did. And unfortunately, there are ways, if you're a seminary student or a seminary graduate, you know that you can sort of tweak your program to emphasize certain things and to de-emphasize others. And the biblical languages, and especially textual history and things like that, are greatly de-emphasized in the vast majority of education today. So you get this, and you may be way ahead of the curve, way ahead of the curve. We're talking about a freely transmitted text when we talk about the New Testament. That's the key issue this evening. A freely transmitted text is one whose transmission is not controlled by an external authority such as a government or a church, ecclesiastical group, religion, whatever else it might be. It is widely copied without constraint. A controlled text is one that is copied under the guidance of an external authority. So what are we talking about here? When you talk about the New Testament, because of the persecution of the church from the very beginning, there was a necessity for a large amount of copying given the growth of the church both geographically and numerically, and the fact that it didn't take the Romans very long to figure out that this weird new cult was based upon written documents, and therefore over time it became illegal to possess them, to produce them, and part of the persecution in the early church, there were different kinds of apostates in the early church. If you were one of the sacrificati, it meant that you offered the sacrifice, the pinch of incense upon the altar, and said, Kaiser Kurios, Caesar is Lord. That was the ultimate form of apostasy. There was the libellatici, which is where you got what was called a libellus. It was a little document that said you had given sacrifice, but you actually hadn't. So you were sort of paying somebody under the table, so you could still do business, but you actually hadn't offered sacrifice. But it was still considered an act of apostasy because you were pretending something. And then there were the traditores. And the traditores were the people, the traders, who had given up the Christian scriptures. Now sometimes Christians were smart enough to realize that the smelly Roman soldier at the door couldn't tell what was 1 Thessalonians and what was the Sunday comics. And so they would give up stuff that was not the Christian scriptures. And yet still, when the persecution would end, the people who had suffered for not giving up scriptures would consider those who had even cheated to be apostates. The reaction of the church to apostasy created some of the greatest schisms of the early church. I'm lecturing on this. I just sort of finished lecturing on this in my church history series that I'm doing at PRBC on Sundays. I notice you're on sermon audio now, so are we. And so if you go over to sermon audio, Phoenix Reformed Baptist Church, I'm 17 lessons into church history, and we just went over all those categories and the sacrifices and the divisions and the schisms and stuff like that in the early church in regards to that particular subject. The traditors would give up the scriptures, and many thousands of New Testament manuscripts were destroyed under the Roman Empire, especially in that time period at the end of the 3rd, beginning of the 4th centuries, when persecution was empire-wide. There was a tremendous amount that went on at that time. And so the New Testament had to be freely transmitted. You didn't have anyone in control of it. When someone wanted to make a copy, remember the New Testament canon developed over time. So, for example, and those of you who are here in 2010 and have just awesome memories, please do not ruin this for everybody else. So Ken, that's you. Just so I can't see you over there, but just so we don't want you shouting out the answer here, because we know that you know all these things. But what book of the New Testament do you think has the fewest manuscript copies? What book of the New Testament do you think has the fewest manuscript copies? We have 5,717. So of those, which book is the least represented amongst all those manuscripts? Yes, sir? Revelation. Why? Not because it's the last book, because the order of the canon developed later. So that you don't know. It was just a wild guess. Ken told you, right? Oh, okay. All right. The reason is that the book of Revelation had to fight so hard for inclusion into the canon. There were a lot of people that looked at that and said, 10-headed monsters, and really, are we sure John had something to do with this? I mean, and I'm glad that there was, I'm glad the early church wasn't running around going, we don't have enough books with 10-headed monsters and sea serpents and stuff like that. Could we have some more? I'm glad that there was a serious examination to check its apostolic credentials and what its message was. I mean, they didn't have Tim LaHaye back then. How in the world could anyone have figured this out? I don't know. But the fact is that Revelation struggled for inclusion in the canon, and that's represented in how few manuscripts we have of it. And I'll show you later on. I think I'll show you later on one of the really interesting textual variants of the book of Revelation. And the text of the book of Revelation is utterly unlike any other part of the New Testament textual transmission history. It's extremely divided, and it's really, really interesting because it came through a sort of a different line of transmission than any of the rest of the New Testament did. Those books, let's say someone comes into a church, they're traveling, and they hear something being read from 1st to 2nd Peter. They've never heard of it before because they don't have 1st, 2nd Peter in their church yet. And they go, what is this? These are writings of Peter. Really? And on the basis of the authority of that church, then a person says, well, I need to bring this to our fellowship. We need to read these words. They would be allowed to do so. It wasn't, what's your experience in being a copyist? Can you show us your union card or, whatever else along those lines? It was, we'd be happy to let you copy our copy of 1st and 2nd Peter and take it back to your fellowship. And that is how things would be distributed over time. So it was not controlled. It was freely transmitted. It had to be, given the historical situation the early church found itself in. There was no papacy at this time. While the Bishop of Rome was considered important primarily in Rome, he was considered important in other places because the old saying was, all roads go to Rome. And it was a large church, and because people would travel in and out of Rome, Rome would know a lot of people. The original importance of the Church of Rome was the church at Rome, not the bishop. Because up until about 140 AD, there was no one elder of the Church of Rome. They had a multiplicity of elders. They had multiple elders. And so there was no papacy. There was no one that could say, okay, we're going to control these things. So it's freely transmitted. Now a controlled text, that's one that is copied under the guidance of an external authority. An external authority. A freely transmitted text will have more textual variance, but will have greater confidence as to the originality. A controlled text will have more uniformity, but much less confidence as to originality. Why? This is important for you to understand. If it's freely transmitted, then there are multiple lines of transmission. One manuscript might get copied 3 or 4 times. And then one of those copies goes someplace else, and then it's copied over another place. And this is how you have a healthy, robust transmission of a text. It's not just limited to one place, it's not limited to one time, you don't have just one group in control of it. Freely transmit. Now that means there's going to be more textual variance, because there's going to be more texts. There's just going to be more manuscripts. There's going to be more demand for this text. A controlled text will have more uniformity, but much less confidence as the originality, because generally in the controlled text you also have revision and redaction, because you can now control the text, and you have only a certain number of manuscripts. And if you only have a certain number of manuscripts and they've been under the control of a particular group that might have vested interest in what is read by that text, well, how do you know that they haven't tampered with it if you don't have any earlier manuscripts by which to compare their work? This is the difference between a freely transmitted text and a controlled text. A freely transmitted text can promise to present the original readings in its manuscript tradition. A controlled text cannot promise the original text past the last redaction or revision, especially if previous versions are destroyed. So the controlled text may say, hey, you just need to trust what we give you. And we are the people who've been entrusted. You know, it's a little bit like, you know, the old Indiana Jones movies. Remember Indiana Jones and the Holy Grail? And you go walk, you get into that cave, and there's all these Holy Grails there. And you've got the old dude, well, before the Nazis break in, which they somehow end up everywhere. But you got the really old priest dude who is like, what, 900 years old or something like that, but dies very quickly. I'm not sure what happens about that. But anyway. And, you know, the idea is, well, we can trust him. Well, what has he been doing for 900 years, okay? And if he's now in control of a particular text, and he's the only one that knows, he could have done anything with it. Well, but we can trust 900-year holy men. You know, really? Okay, all right, you think so. That's how it works. So, some of you have seen this before. Notice how we have moving manuscripts on the screen. Now, I want you all to know, I designed this graphic myself. So, if you cannot control your amazement, your oohs and ahs, try to, but if a few escape, I won't necessarily be hurt. Okay, so just so you know. So what we have with the New Testament is what I call multivocality. Multivocality. You have multiple authors writing at multiple times from multiple locations to multiple audiences. The New Testament was not written in 1 week in one place. It was written over years by multiple authors in different locations. There were no fax machines. There was no way for these authors to collaborate and to coordinate with one another. That just simply isn't the nature of this New Testament text. Now, you got to realize your next door neighbor, your pagan next door neighbor does not know this, and unfortunately your Christian next door neighbor probably doesn't know it either. Because the New Testament's just always been the New Testament. They've never really thought through, which books were written before which, what was the relationship between them, when were they written, who's the earliest books, who's the latest books, and sometimes we don't know. I mean, most people feel like Revelation is probably one of the last ones to be written, but we don't know that for absolute certainty. Was James the first New Testament book written? Galatians? What's the relationship between the Gospels and Paul's epistles time-wise? Lots of theories. Lots of theories. Unfortunately, many times those theories are stated as facts when they really aren't facts by scholars. But what we do know, beyond any shadow of a doubt, is we look at Paul's letters, and we know that he wrote those at different times. Sometimes he's in prison. Sometimes he's not in prison. Sometimes he's writing to a church because they're having some serious problems. Sometimes he's writing a church just because he wants to communicate to them and talk about the glories of the gospel and things like that. Multiple authors, multiple occasions, multiple times, multiple audiences. This immediately results in multiple streams of transmission. For example, have you ever noticed something odd about the book of Ephesians? How long was Paul in Ephesus? You know, around 3 years, 2.5, 3 years. Long time. And yet, have you noticed that the book of the book of Ephesians has nothing personal in it. No personal greeting. There's all sorts of personal greetings in other books. Nothing in Ephesians. And then in Colossians chapter 4, the church at Colossae is instructed to read the epistle coming from where? Laodicea. How many of you read Laodiceans this morning for your devotion? Missing epistle? Possibly. I think there's a much greater probability that some of you did read that epistle for devotions this morning, because it's probably Ephesians. Why? It seems that Ephesians was written to be a circular letter. It was to be distributed around the churches in the Lycus River Valley. That's why there's nothing really personal attached to it. And actually, interestingly enough, there's a interesting textual variant at the beginning of Ephesians chapter 1 where the term Ephesus doesn't appear, which would make sense if it was meant to be a circular letter that was to be distributed amongst the churches. So it would explain its non-personal nature, parallel passages with what's in Colossians. But think about what that would mean. If Ephesians was meant to be distributed that way, what would happen as that epistle went through the churches in the Lycus River Valley? Do you think it would just be read one day, one Sunday morning, they go ahead and read it and then just ship it off to the next city? What are they going to do before they ship it off to the next city? They can make a copy of it. So here you have one original automatically being copied 7 or 8 times in different geographical locations. Hello, once that horse leaves the barn, you ain't ever changing that text again. How in the world could you edit Ephesians if that was its textual history? How could you insert doctrines into it, take doctrines out of it? It would be impossible. Instead, what we'd have is, as we look at the earlier and earlier manuscripts, you'd have all sorts of different versions of Ephesians. Some of which have this doctrine in it, some of which have that doctrine in it. And the one thing that we know about the New Testament manuscripts is that's not what we've got. It doesn't matter whether the manuscript is from 1500 or 150. It's the same Ephesians. It's the same letter. It's the same organization. It's the same message. No doctrines put in, no doctrines taken out. That's what this multivocality is all about. Because these manuscripts then would be distributed, would be carried by Christian missionaries all across the known world. And what would happen over time is you would begin to get collections taking place. So we have some very early manuscripts. I'm going to show you some pictures of some here before we get done here, where slowly what happens is you start getting gospel collections. Matthew wasn't originally bound together with Luke. Luke would have been with Acts, but instead, over time, you get a collection. So we have P66 and P75. I'll show you pictures of these that are gospel manuscripts. And then we get collections of Paul's writings. And eventually, in the early 4th century, you pretty much get the New Testament being put together. But up to this point, it has been being transmitted in parts because it was written in parts. And because of the persecution, you generally did not carry around big honking books with you because they would be hard to hide and to keep out of the eyesight of the Roman soldiers that are looking for these types of things. So the point is that what you see happening around the known world is you have a distribution of these texts all over the place. And never is there a time, because of the free transmission of the text, where anyone can come along, add, edit, delete. Despite the fact of the history, you remember that only, less than 10 years ago, we had the Da Vinci Code craze. And everywhere I went, I'd be traveling anywhere, and you'd sit down at a gate at the airport, and someone is reading the Da Vinci Code. And it was everywhere. And then they came out with the movie, and Tom Hanks, and blah, 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 blah. And even though it was in the fiction section, because it was fiction, Dan Brown put in the front of the book, everything in this book is based upon factuality. Well, that was a royal, multi-million-dollar lie. Because basically, what he presented was this idea that up until Constantine and the Council of Nicaea, all the early Christians had believed that Jesus was just a regular guy with a wife and kids. And then Constantine comes along and invents this divine Jesus, and he gathers up all the old original Gospels and destroys them, and writes 4 new Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that present Jesus as this divine figure. And that's how you end up with the fake Jesus of the Catholic Church, quote unquote. Well, historically, that is just a joke. We actually tried to get him to do a debate on the subject. Didn't work, but we tried. That actually what ended up leading to the debate with John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Ford. But we originally tried to get Dan Brown, offered him money and the whole 9 yards, like he needed it. Actually, I guess he's an avid tennis player, so the guy trying to set it up was a tennis pro, so he offered him lessons in the whole 9 yards, but we couldn't get him to come out and play, because it would have been fun. It would have been really fun. It would have been so much fun. But anyway, that would have been just a royal blast. But the whole idea of what he presented was just absolutely the exact opposite of what the historical facts demonstrate, and could be proven that way. That's why any debate would have just been as easy as could possibly be. And yet, I can guarantee you, there are all sorts of people in your place of work that are far more familiar with and trusting of the Dan Brown narrative than they are the reality of the history of the New Testament. They really are. And you need to realize that's a barrier to the gospel for you. You try to present what the New Testament teaches about the gospel to someone who has been infected with that kind of thinking, and you wonder why they come up with the type of responses they do. Well, there's a reason for it, and this is where it comes from. So, there's my phrase, multivocality. It is vitally important to realize the transmission of the text in the New Testament did not follow a single line of transmission. When you listen to Bart Ehrman, what Bart Ehrman will often say is he'll say, well look, if you were a Roman Christian in the year 120, all you know about the stories of Jesus is what someone has told someone has told someone has told someone has told someone. That's all you know. And at every point along that line, there's been change, there's been expansion, there's been whatever else. And so how can we ever really know? How can we ever really trust? And now Ehrman knows about multivocality. Ehrman's a smart guy. When it comes to facts, Ehrman's almost always right. It's his interpretation of the facts that is where the problem is, and it depends on whether he's talking to fellow scholars or whether he's talking to just plain old people. because he gives a different story depending on where he is. When he's talking to fellow scholars, we're playing around when it comes to the original text. We've got the best text we can possibly have, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When he's trying to make money with New York Times bestsellers and destroying people's faith, that's when, well, we don't know what it originally said, blah, 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 blah. So the story changes, but he knows. And what Ehrman will talk about is the phone game, where, you know, it's been years and years since I played it. I guess in some places it's called Chinese whispers, though I'm sure that's probably extremely politically incorrect and probably illegal in California. It was a phone game where you'd sit in a circle and you'd whisper something to the person next to you, and they're supposed to pass it around, and once it gets back to you, it's been changed in hilarious and funny ways into another language or whatever else. And we all know how that works, and that's what he's trying to invoke in the mind, is that's how the New Testament came to us, is through this extremely unreliable, highly questionable mechanism. But that's not how it happened, and he knows that's not how it happened. Because of this multifocality, because of just the nature of the text itself, you immediately have to have multiple lines of transmission. And so you don't have just one line, you have multiple lines. And once you have multiple lines, what you can no longer do is do any type of meaningful editing or redacting, taking stuff out and putting stuff in. You do end up with textual variation, but the more multiple lines you have, the more data you have, the more material you have to correct and to make sure that the original readings have been maintained. And that's exactly what we have with the New Testament. And so when my Muslim friends come along and say, the New Testament's been corrupted, and the original disciples were Muslims, and they didn't believe in the deity of Christ, and all that stuff's been put in. Well, when was it put in? They don't like to be nailed down at that point. People like Shabir Ali, I've pushed him pretty hard. We did a debate on what the earliest Christians believed about Jesus at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And he basically had to admit that the very earliest sources identified Jesus as Yahweh. And I feel like he admitted that he lost the debate because he decided to go before Christian sources to Jewish sources. But the Jews didn't believe that, so that can't be. Well, if you've had to jump back to the Jewish sources, what you're admitting is the earliest sources do teach the deity of Christ. And that's what this debate was about. And so you just admitted that your position cannot deal with that. But that's the reality. So when could this corruption have taken place? And they're loath to say that it took place after Muhammad, because we have so many manuscripts to go before Muhammad. But if it was before Muhammad, then why did they make some of the changes they did make? And we still have manuscripts going back to within a very brief period of time between the original writings and the first manuscripts we have. So who did the changes? Why is there no evidence? Why, as we dig up earlier and earlier manuscripts, do we not find completely different stories? Why is this? And the answer is, well, because you could not have possibly made the changes that they did. So the New Testament originated in multiple places, multiple authors, books being sent to multiple locations, very, very important. This means the text was never under the control of a single individual or group at no time in its history, time of authorship, or at any point during its time of transmission, were the New Testament documents under the control of an individual or group. As soon as Paul said, send it, as soon as that roll of papyrus, not roll of papyrus, but leaves of papyrus, left that room where the apostle was, with his intention that was going to be delivered to the church at Colossae, or the church at Thessalonica, or whatever else it might have been. Once it left there, it was no longer under the control of anyone in the sense of one overarching group that could add things, change things, check on things, whatever else. It was a freely transmitted text. As a result, we can look forward to finding even earlier manuscripts of New Testament documents as the free transmission of the text has provided us with a solid basis for asserting that we continue to possess the original readings of the authors themselves. This is something called tenacity. Tenacity. Now, tenacity is normally a term that you have heard being used of a good character trait. Someone is tenacious. They don't give up. They persevere in a task. But tenacity is a term that was used by German New Testament textual scholar Kurt Ahland in describing the New Testament textual tradition, all the manuscripts taken as a whole. And what did he mean by that? What he meant by tenacity is that once a reading appears in the New Testament manuscript tradition, it stays there, even if it's a silly reading. And it's interesting, for years I used one particular illustration of this, and then I was listening to a lecture by Bart Ehrman, and he used the same illustration I did. I used it before he did. He didn't steal it from me, but we both were using the same manuscript as an example. We have a manuscript of, I think it's the Gospel of Luke, if I recall correctly. It's Matthew or Luke, where the scribe just had a bad day. I guess Starbucks was closed on his way into work or whatever else it might have been, and the dog ate his reading glasses or something. I don't know what it was, but he was copying the genealogies of Jesus, and he was copying his original had 2 columns, but for some reason he copied straight across the columns. Now think about the mess that would create. The result is nonsensical. God ends up somewhere in the middle and has a daddy, I think, named Ferris or something like that. And he clearly was on another planet when he did this. But the point is, we still have the manuscript. Now, no one believes that that has any originality as far as have anything to do with the original, anything like that. But it's a humorous example of the fact that, wow, here's somebody that really, really blew it. Whenever there has been a disruption in the transmission of the text, there's evidence of it. We see evidence of it. And that means even silly readings are maintained in the manuscript tradition. You might say, that doesn't sound good to me. Think about what it also means. If the silly readings maintain their presence in the manuscript tradition because of tenacity, guess what else maintains its presence in the New Testament tradition? The original readings. The original readings are still there. Now, there may be situations, there's one, I think it's in Galatians somewhere, we have one, well, there's actually a couple, but there's a couple textual variants that are really hard. There's like 5 possibilities. There's like 5 possibilities. And they're tough. I mean, it's normally just one word, but it's really difficult to see exactly which ones make the most sense, things like that. But here's the point. One of those 5 is the right one. It hasn't disappeared. Most of the time it's just a choice between 1 or 2. We saw, for example, 1 John 3:1, and we are. Most variants are more simple like that, but there are some tough ones. Why even bother putting the effort out if you don't believe the original is there anymore? I mean, it would be somewhat of a fool's errand to waste your time trying to figure out what the original reading was if you don't even think the originals exist anymore. The point is, the originals are all there. And when people look at me and say, well, I want to know where the Word of God is, and what they're saying is, I want to have a simple text that I can simply bow to, and whether it's what was originally written or not, I don't care. I don't want to put out that type of effort. I am theologically lazy. There are people like that. There are entire movements like that. They wouldn't appreciate the fact that I just called them theologically lazy, but that's what they are. I don't want to do all this work. I don't care that Christians have been doing it since the 2nd century. Just give me something to put my stamp of approval on. And, the ESV only movement. Let's just start the ESV only movement. We all have the ESV anymore. Let's just get rid of all other English translations and say, this is it. This is the final version, right? That's the easy way of doing things. Don't have to worry about anything anymore. But that's not a truthful way of doing things, is it? The question is, how accurate does the ESV represent the original text and all the rest of that kind of stuff, and all the issues are still there. We can ignore them if we want. But there are those who would say, this is what I want. This is exactly the way that I'm going to come up with my text. Problem is, that when we look, I understand that motivation. I understand when people look at me. I taught textual criticism in Ukraine about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And I had a pastor from Van, who came from Donetsk. And he was, his church had been destroyed, and his it's a war zone now, and all the rest of that stuff. But he actually had already graduated, and he was auditing the class. And we sort of got through most of this material, and he sort of puts his hand up, and my translators, it was funny. I sort of knew what was coming before my translator started translating. Because I had sort of been watching this fellow, and I had sort of watching the gears just turning in his mind. And he said, I understand what you're saying. I'm not arguing with the facts of what you're saying, anything like that at all. He said, but I'll just be perfectly honest with you. I could never tell my people this stuff. I could never explain it to them. We're struggling just to find enough food. And they have their traditional text, and that's it. And they're not interested in church history, and they're not interested in original manuscripts or Tenacity or Multivocality or anything else. They've got their translation in their language, and that's it. And anything beyond that, there's going to be massive rebellion. And no matter how slowly I even tried to introduce them to these things, there's no way I could ever explain it to them. There are people that are extremely traditional in their understanding, and anything that challenges that tradition, they consider to be destructive. I get that. There are people that just really, really, really dislike me. Not because of anything other than the fact that I raise questions that I recognize are absolutely vital, because their traditions may be good enough for them. What about their kids when they go to university? Why are they all ending up as atheists? Well, there's a reason for that. Their tradition is not robust enough to survive the attacks that are being launched against that tradition. It is indefensible. And on the one side, you have people saying, well, don't bother people in the churches. On the other hand, is it, why are we losing the next generation? And they're all becoming atheists and so on and so forth. Well, there might be a connection between the two. Might be a connection between the two. But here's the point. When people look at me and say, I want to have the Word of God. Where is it? You textual, critical, scholar, humanist person, you. Satanically inspired, and then it just goes on from there. And I can, with absolute certainty, affirm we possess every single word the apostles ever wrote. I do not doubt that for a second. Do not doubt that for a second. Well, but I want to know exactly what this textual variant is or that textual variant is. Well, I can tell you that it's worthwhile examining every single textual variant because we have the original. And so there is worth to doing that. But if what you're fundamentally saying is, I reject the way that God has preserved His Word. Because you see, this tenacity and this multivocality is how God has preserved His Word. Which would you rather have? Would you rather have to seriously be constantly wondering whether the New Agers are right when they say that the Bible used to contain the doctrine of reincarnation, but they took it out at the Council of Constantinople? They actually make that claim. What if the manuscript tradition, what if God hadn't used multivocality? What if there was a controlled transmission of the text? If we had a controlled transmission of the New Testament text, we would be open to the allegation that maybe the church could have altered the text at the Council of Constantinople and removed the doctrine of reincarnation and then destroyed any manuscripts that existed before that, if there was a controlled transmission of the text. How would we respond to that? We wouldn't be able to respond to that. Then, well, you just need to trust the church. Just need to trust the church. We've seen how well that has worked down through the ages. Just ask the papacy. Just ask Martin Luther about trusting the church. So there you are. What they're saying is, I wish God hadn't preserved the text the way he did. It's not clean enough for me. But I don't think most people who make that argument really have thought through the cost that they're willing to pay. Dan Wallace has put it correctly, and maybe now you have a foundation for understanding it. Dan Wallace has put it correctly. There are a lot of people that are willing to trade truth for certainty. A lot of people who are willing to trade truth for certainty. Because I've met a lot of young Mormon missionaries. They are absolutely certain the Book of Mormon is the Word of God. But what have they done? They've traded truth for that certainty. And that certainty does not give them truth. They are certain of a lie. They're certain of a falsehood. But they're certain of it. They've had a spiritual testimony. Well, that's a Mormon. That's part of a cult, right? Christians would never do that. Really? Yeah, actually they would. Actually they would, sadly. And have. So we have the original readings. The transmission of the New Testament textual tradition is characterized by an extremely impressive degree of tenacity. Once a reading occurs, it will persist with obstinacy. And here's a quotation really quickly as we wrap up. It is precisely the overwhelming mass of New Testament textual tradition, assuming it's the wholesome teaching of New Testament textual criticism, which provides an assurance of certainty in establishing the original text. We can be certain that among the New Testament manuscripts there is still a group of witnesses which preserves the original form of the text, despite the pervasive authority of ecclesiastical tradition and the prestige of the later text. That's Kurt and Barbara Olland, Text of the New Testament, pages 291 through 292. They established the New Testament Center in Munster, which is one of the leading New Testament areas today. New Testament areas of collation of manuscripts and things like that. So what we'll do after a lunch this afternoon is finally actually take a look at some of these manuscripts. It's one thing to talk about them. I mean, I've shown you P45. We'll be looking at P52 here. Take a look at some of these manuscripts. You might say, oh, that's exactly what I want to do on a Saturday afternoon. I sit around looking at ancient manuscripts. Well, I've had the opportunity of seeing a lot of these, and for most believers, I have found that they find it really helpful that instead of just a little note that says some manuscripts say, to actually see them, to recognize they have an existence, and to see the connection that we have to those who hand wrote these things. I really wonder how many of us would even have a Bible if we had to hand copy our own edition. I've often said we have trouble getting people to show up on time for Sunday school, let alone if they had to actually hand copy their own edition of the Bible in the process. I just wonder how many people would have much more than 3rd John, in their canon. But these are believers in many instances that risk their lives to possess these scriptures. For me, anyways, it's extremely encouraging to realize that we're not the first generation that have loved this scripture. And it's neat to see that people have loved it so much they're willing to die for it, because that's why we have what we have. And that's a good thing, I think, for us to remember. The price has been paid to have what we have. So we'll be doing that this afternoon, and we come back together again, I believe, at 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock. We will see you then.